Hi everyone. So for this video, we're going to go over Edgar Allan Poe, and then in the next video, we'll go over Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and we'll get right into it. So Edgar Allan Poe, just a little bit about him. He was born in 1809 and died in 1849. He's best known for his stories of mystery and horror. Many people know him from The Raven that he wrote in 1845. It's one of his most well-known poems of all time. But he's also very famous because The Murders in the Rue Morgue that he wrote in 1841 was the first detective story ever written. If you like anything like Agatha Christie or Sir Arthur Conan Doyle or other mystery novels of today, he was the father of this ability to start mystery novels to make sure there was kind of a starting point and a formula to follow. He didn't have the best life. Excuse me. His mother died of tuberculosis when Poe was young, and he was taken in by his foster family, the Allans, where he gets his middle name from. He grew up, he went to school, and then he went to university, but he gambled a lot while he was at university. So his foster father said, I'm not going to keep giving you money to fund you gambling, cut him off from funds. So he leaves university, he goes to find his sweetheart, finds out she's already engaged to another man, and at this point he's just absolutely devastated. So he decides he's going to join the military under a false name, so that way he can just, join the military and get away from everyone and kind of disappear. That is until he learns of his foster mother's death, who also happens to die from tuberculosis. Sorry about that. Dogs get crazy sometimes. All right, so he finds out that his mother died also of tuberculosis. So his foster father buys his freedom from the army. He goes into mourning for a while, and then his foster father figures, well, if you want to be in the army, well, there's no better place to learn than to go to West Point. And that wasn't, the purpose of Poe originally joining the army. So he decides he's going to purposely get himself expelled. So at this point, he starts writing. He marries a young cousin of his, Virginia Clem, and he writes many, many stories at this time period. He worked for newspapers, but he gained a reputation as a drunkard, not because he was often drunk, but when he was drunk, too many people would see him drunk and assume that he was a terrible drunkard all the time. And a lot of times when he would work for these newspapers, he was criticizing, part of literary criticism, but also partially attacking his contemporaries and their stories. So it certainly earned him a reputation and some enemies. His wife ended up dying young of the same disease that killed his mother and foster mother, tuberculosis. It was a common disease of the time, but it's sad that it happened to him 3 times. He traveled, he was briefly engaged to a young woman, flirted some more. That engagement broke off. Eventually, he found his former sweetheart, who was also had lost her spouse, so she was now a widow, and they become engaged. After the summer of their brief engagement together in 1849, they're still planning the wedding, still doing everything. He goes to Baltimore and he never returned. He was found dead, though the cause to this day is uncertain. People found him on a park bench dead. It could have been that he died of alcohol poisoning from drinking, heart failure from all the difficulties of his life. It could have been something else. There have been many, many hypotheses, including many people claiming that he was murdered. All right, so our story, The Cask of Amontillado, was written in 1847. So just like usual, think about your feelings about the story. One thing that I really like about feelings about this story rather than this one is not just whether I like the story or not, but literally how it makes me feel. So with this story, when I say about the way it makes me feel, we're watching or reading this story through the eyes of the murderer. And we don't realize until the very end that he is the murderer. So at first, you kind of feel a little bit bad for Montresor, because you can tell he's been wronged by Fortunato, and you know something's not right by the way that he's talking, but we wouldn't think of what he's actually going to do. And then he does it, and it's a twist of, oh my God, I didn't think he was actually going to kill this person. So that changes how you feel, and I don't know, just reading it through his eyes always makes me feel creeped out more afterwards than if it had been in third person. So one thing we also want to think about is, what exactly did Fortunato do wrong? We're told at the beginning of the story that Fortunato had done him 1,000 injuries and one insult. Now, this could be many different things at the time period. It could be a literal insult, or it could be an insult to his honor in some way, which could have been something like sleeping with Montresor's wife, or just telling others that he was a bad person, or violating the rules of hospitality. These are all potential things that could insult the honor of Montresor. So we don't know exactly what Fortunato did. We also are told that this story takes place 50 years ago, because at the end of the story, Montresor says that it was 50 years prior that all of this occurred. And Montresor is the one telling the story. So there's a chance that Montresor, because he's the murderer, is not telling the truth about what the insult was, because he wants people to feel bad for him. And there's also a chance that since he's telling the story 50 years later, what if that he doesn't remember anymore what it was that Fortunato did? Setting, the majority of the setting takes place at, well, I was at time period probably around 15 to 1600s, maybe even up to the 1800s. It's kind of not easily placeable time period wise. Geographical setting, it has to be in a country that celebrates Carnival. So obviously France does Mardi Gras, so it's not going to be that. Montresor itself sounds a little bit like an Italian name, same with Fortunato, so it's probably set in Italy. But the majority of our physical setting, we start off on the street, but the majority of the setting takes place in the catacombs, which are a ancient form of burial that they would have bones built into the walls in order to make this um, passageway into the tunnels where the family members would be actually buried. Now, this could be because they were ancient members and they ran out of room for the new members. There are multiple reasons. Obviously, the French catacombs, more because of people dying from the plague that they were put down there. So the setting of the story, we also get it from the further down into the earth that he goes, this confinement of movement that we get even before we get to Fortunato being walled in by Montresor. So that confinement of movement, as they go from this big open air party to the stank and humid atmosphere underneath the ground, really shows that confinement of movement building the suspense, building that foreshadowing that something bad is going to happen. So for our characters, we only really have Montresor and Fortunato, and we get a little bit about Montresor's family. Montresor, when we talk about him being sympathetic or not, it does not mean that they themselves are sympathetic to the cause of someone else. It's whether you, the reader, feel for them in some way. So that's where I say, in the beginning, you feel almost sympathetic for Montresor, that he he's been kind of badly treated by Fortunato, according to his own account, and that, but that's where it gets tricky, because afterwards it's hard to, fathom seeing what he does with such logic in his mind when he's clearly not altogether if he's willing to resort to murder. Towards the end, when he's telling the story, you can tell he's telling it to either us, the reader, or someone else who becomes the placeholder for us, the reader. And you want to think about, is he confessing or is he bragging? That there might be a slight difference. But he's telling this 50 years after it happened. So is it that he's finally confessing because maybe he's on his deathbed and he wants to confess his sins? Or is he bragging? Part of that is whether you believe him to be a dynamic or static character, flat around. Is he flat because he has no good qualities and he's just the evil murderer? Is he more round because we see from his point of view? Is he dynamic because even though he doesn't learn his lesson and change his mind at the very beginning when he first kills Fortunato, he might be dynamic in the fact that he's confessing his sins, but that might also make him static as a character because maybe he's confessing just to protect his own soul at the end of his life, not because he actually feels bad. Also, is he bragging? Some people take the addressee of to you at the end of the story as a potential threat. So to the reader, basically, of I've just told you the story, what are you gonna do about it, basically? Fortunato, we want to think about for him, he is a very flat character. He is the stereotype of the fool character. But did he learn anything? We really don't see him as the dynamic character because, again, we're seeing him through Montresor's eyes, but he doesn't even seem to know what he did or learn a lesson from it. And that leads a lot of people to believe that Fortunato really never figured out what he did to know, what it was. Maybe he didn't do anything at all. Maybe it was an excuse Montresor made up. Was it fair? Well, that depends on what it was he did. We don't know what Fortunato did to know if death was fair for what he did or not. Obviously, this is set in a different time period, but even then, the revenge tragedy is something that is usually against the law, but by this time that it's set. So whether it was fair or not, that would have been for a jury to decide, not for Montresor to take matters into his own hands. Some things that we do know about Fortunato, he has his addiction to wine. He's already drunk at the party, and he's willing to follow Montresor to taste this rare vintage of wine. And he is continuously drinking throughout the story, so he clearly has an addiction. He is insensitive, especially if he's giving all these, the 1,000 insults and one injury, or 1,000 injuries, one insult, whichever way it goes. All of those could show that he's clearly insensitive to others, if that is the truth that he did these. He's prideful for sure. Montresor knows this enough about him that he purposely says, well, I'll just go to this other wine taster. You're busy. You're already inebriated. I don't want to pull you away from the party. And he knows that saying that other person's name will be enough to set Fortunato off. That he's like, no, no, you don't want to trust that guy. I'm the one you want to trust to taste your wine to make sure it's the real deal. So he's clearly very prideful in his abilities. He's also very greedy, the fact that he wants to be the one to taste it. And clearly he has a lot of trust in Montresor. He doesn't suspect a thing until Montresor starts literally building the wall behind him. So he has a lot of puts trust in the wrong places. Especially again, what do we know about what he did? Clearly, he didn't know he did anything wrong because he still had his trust in Montresor. And Montresor's family obviously is a little bit of a central character, to put it lightly, because throughout the story, Montresor mentions his family because it's his family crypt, but he also says his family is not Italian, yet he has an Italian burial ground where most of his family is buried. So this could lead to the question in some people's minds of whether Montresor is really Montresor. Is this really the Montresor family crypt? Could it be the family crypt where Montresor, the character, his family members bury people they want dead? Could that be why it's the Montresor family burial ground? Could it be that the Montresor family owned the burial ground and he's not really a Montresor? Could it be that the Montresors came to this area and um took over this burial ground and that the bones around him are the Italians and then his family is, you know, in the tombs themselves? There are a lot of different questions. And again, it leads us to believe of, well, if this is your family crypt and you're not Italian, then who are you, Montresor? And we don't get a lot revealed to us about him either. Again, this is where sometimes a first person narrative can be like that fly on the wall observer because we can't always, we don't know everything unless the character tells us. For some symbols, many stand out, but the most conspicuous symbol is the Montresor coat of arms. So we've got this picture here, a little bit cut off, but it says the Latin phrase at the end in English means no one attacks me with impunity. So that's already very suspicious that his entire family's crest is based upon if someone attacks me, it won't be without revenge. I will get my revenge for what happened. And we can see this represented here too. The snake is biting the man's heel, it's what everyone focuses on, but it itself is being stepped on. So who is the real problem in this? Did the man step on the snake and the snake bit to protect himself? Or did the snake bite and the man happened to step down on the snake? It's kind of a bad situation altogether. Some other things with this Montresor family crest, the Azure field, and there's a lot that with crests. There's a whole history to crest making and the specific symbols, the specific color choices. As you can see here, this one just has kind of like almost like a wing like and a little crown. It doesn't really have a true like stanchions like a royal family house crest would have. So one thing with the azure color of the field around the snake and the foot is that the color blue could represent the blue poppies, which was a common drug of the time period. We know this now as opium. So it's possible that it's a representation of that. Opium dens were very popular in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So it's possible that it's a reference to that. And again, another reference to addiction. Also, interestingly, now obviously the snake can only bite so many places, but it has enough space between where it's being stepped on that it purposely bites on the Achilles heel, which, we know from common is someone's weak spot, and it's a weak tendon in the foot based on biology. So the interesting part with this, again, you have to know the original myth as to why it's our weak spot, and that is because in the story of Achilles, he, as a child, is born as a demigod. Sorry about the dogs. So Achilles is born as a demigod, and his mother wants to protect him because of a prophecy that he'll be killed in battle someday. And as is the case with most prophecies in Greek mythology, the minute you try to do something to stop the prophecy, it's going to make the prophecy happen anyway. Well, there is a river called the River Styx in the underworld, And usually, if you were to step into it, you would die if you were mortal. Now, in this particular case, if you don't fully submerge yourself in it, you won't die. So, Achilles' mother, Tethys, I believe it's Tethys, but Achilles' mother hangs him by his heel into the water to make him immortal. And so that everywhere except where her palm held, which happened to be his heel, would be immortal and would be impenetrable. So he'd be safe from battle wounds. And when he goes to the Trojan War, it just so happens that no one actually finds out about his weak spot on the heel. It just so happens that a spear lands on that weak spot and he dies anyway. So we've often called it the Achilles heel based on that story, and that's why it symbolizes someone's weakness. And the snake is, again, we said that the snake is biting the heel, but also because it's being stepped on. And it's also possible that the foot is stepping on the snake because it's being bitten. We don't know which way started it, but clearly it represents that no one attacks me with impunity, meaning that no one will attack me without getting revenge. And I like to see the Montresor family as the snake themselves because they're willing to bite at your weakness in order to protect themselves. All right, finally, some themes in this story: freedom and confinement. Obviously, the minute you have someone walled up at the end of their lives, that is a form of confinement versus up in the air with the freedom. And what makes someone truly free or truly confined? Big theme of betrayal because Fortunato puts his trust in Montresor, and that was the wrong move. Drugs and alcohol are referenced, so that automatically becomes a theme, but mostly because it's a message of the dangers of drugs and alcohol. Mortality, usually the minute death is involved, mortality becomes a theme in a story, but also a big thing of foolishness and folly. So, when we see Fortunato, he is literally dressed as a jester or a fool. And so he represents this theme very well. He goes about clearly not knowing that he's hurting other people potentially, and he is dressed like a fool, he acts like a fool, even to the point of being a prideful fool, because he keeps insisting on, no, 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 I'll be fine, when Montresor did technically give him an out, but whether we believe Montresor would have actually left the catacombs with Fortunato or not, that's up to interpretation. And the last bit, some irony. Fortunato's name in Italian means fortunate, but clearly he isn't. So usually when we see a character name that means something like this, or that, irony in a story is when we believe it's going to go one way, but it actually goes the complete opposite way. So you see this character named Fortunato, meaning fortunate, very similar to fortunate. Even if you don't know Italian, you can kind of tell what it would be about. And so we think everything's going to be fine. And that kind of leads into that plus Montresor not telling us he's going to kill Fortunato until he actually does it. All of that leads us to really believe everything's going to be fine until it suddenly isn't. The tone. So again, this is how the author approaches. Obviously, the mood would be what we feel. So, we might feel the sadness and anger of Montresor. We might feel later kind of the creepiness of ourselves. But the tone is the way the author or the narrator is approaching, how everything is written. And it's very elegant. So maybe Montresor is, high enough of a person in society that he's allowed to have his own crypt rather than just being buried, having his family buried in a common graveyard. But it's also very creepy the way the narrator kind of approaches the situation, the way the author approaches the writing. of such a character. The title itself, The Cask of Amontillado, itself could be something interesting about the writing style too, because cask is part of the word casket. We never actually see a cask of wine that they drink from, because that was just a lure, the bait to get Fortunato to follow Montresor. But the cask itself being part of the word casket, that is something that lets us know that, besides the fact that it's a story by Poe, that it's probably not going to end well. All right, so I hope that helps with studying Poe, and next video we'll study Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Charlotte Perkins Gilman.